The snow had been falling since noon, but by nightfall it had turned into something meaner. Silas Mercer stood at the window of his cabin and watched the storm move through the valley like something alive and angry, bending the pines sideways, burying the fence posts he'd spent 3 weeks setting in October. The glass in the window frame rattled in its rotting wood, and the single lamp on the table threw a circle of yellow light that didn't reach the corners of the room. He was 39 years old and had been living alone for 5 years. That was the arithmetic of his life now. Not what he'd built or done or survived, but what remained after everything else had been taken. A ranch. A mule named Cutter, who had opinions about weather. 2 horses who were smarter than most men he'd known, and the kind of quiet that stops feeling like peace after a while and starts feeling like a door nobody ever knocks on. He poured himself a cup of coffee that had been sitting on the stove too long and didn't care. He drank it standing up, watching the storm. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. That was one of the things he'd gotten good at over the years. Not thinking. When you'd lost enough, thinking became a kind of punishment. Better to just do. Check the water trough, mend the bridle, stack the wood, sleep, wake up and do it again. He set the cup down on the table and went to bank the fire. That was when he heard it, not the wind. He knew the wind. He'd been listening to it for 5 winters in this valley, and he knew every register it had. The low moan across the ridge, the high shriek through the chimney pipe, the particular sound it made when it hit the barn at the right angle and turned the whole structure into something that sounded like a living thing groaning. He knew all of it. This was different. He stood very still. There it was again, faint, directional, coming from the northeast, from somewhere past the tree line where the old Tilden cabin sat empty and half collapsed, had sat that way since old Harlan Tilden died of a stroke 3 winters back, and his sons never came to claim the property. A human sound. That was the only way he knew to describe it. Not animal, not the storm playing tricks. A human being in the dark making a sound that meant they were in trouble. Silas stood at the fire for another 10 seconds. Then he went for his coat. Chipo, he almost didn't make it to the tree line. The wind out in the open was a different animal than what it looked like through the window. It hit him full in the face when he came around the corner of the barn and stole the breath right out of him, and for a moment he had to stop and turn his back to it, hunching over until his lungs figured out what to do. Snow drove horizontal across the ground, fine and hard as ground glass. He couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. He had a lantern. He had lit it in the barn, but the wind kept fighting him for the flame, and twice it guttered out completely, and he had to stop and relight it with numb fingers and a match he could barely hold. He had his rifle slung over his shoulder, not because he expected trouble, but because he'd spent enough years as a frontier scout to know that a man who went out into the dark without a weapon wasn't being brave. He was being stupid. The Tilden place was maybe 400 yards from his barn. He'd walked it in summer in 5 minutes. Tonight it took him close to 20, and by the time the dark shape of the collapsed porch roof came into view through the snow, he'd lost feeling in his toes and his beard had iced over on one side. He stopped outside what remained of the front door, half off its hinges, pushed inward by old snow or old weather, or both, and lifted the lantern. "Hello," he said. His voice came out rough, barely carrying over the wind. "Nothing. I'm not here to cause you harm." He waited. "Heard something from my place. Just want to make sure nobody's hurt." Silence. He almost turned around. Almost told himself it was the wind, that he'd been alone so long he was starting to hear things, that he should go back and get his feet warm before he lost toes over somebody's imagination. Then he heard the breathing. More than one person. Coming from the back of the cabin, behind the interior wall that had mostly held when the roof on the far end came down. Shallow. Trying to be quiet. Failing. Silas pushed the door open and stepped inside. There were 6 of them. He saw the eyes first, catching the lantern light from the shadows against the back wall, wide and white-rimmed with fear. A cluster of them at different heights, like something you'd see on nocturnal animals caught in lamplight. He stopped moving immediately and held the lantern out to the side so it wasn't in their faces. "Easy," he said, the way he'd say it to a spooked horse. "Easy now." They were children. That was the first thing that registered, and it hit him somewhere low in the chest with a force that surprised him. Children, and they were in bad shape. Huddled together against the wall, arms around each other, dressed in clothes that weren't near enough for this weather. thin cotton work shirts, pants that had probably fit somebody else once, shoes that were falling apart. One of the younger ones, a boy maybe 5 or 6 years old, wasn't wearing shoes at all. He had cloth tied around his feet. That was what passed for shoes. They ranged in age from that small boy up to, he guessed, maybe 14 or 15. The oldest was a girl standing in front of the others with her arms slightly out from her sides, the way someone stands when they're putting themselves between danger and something they're protecting. She was thin. All of them were thin, the kind of thin that wasn't from missing a few meals, the kind that came from a long time of not enough. But this girl was something else. She had a cut above her right eye that had bled and dried and cracked and started bleeding again, a dark line frozen partway down her temple, and she was shaking, not just from cold, but from the specific effort of staying on her feet. She looked at him like she was calculating something, not panicking, measuring. "We're not going back," she said. Her voice was steadier than it had any right to be. Silas looked at the boy without shoes. He looked at a little girl, maybe 7, who had her face buried in the oldest girl's side, fingers twisted in the fabric of her shirt. He looked at 3 other children, 2 boys and another girl, arranged behind the oldest one, watching him with the kind of caution that didn't belong on children's faces. "Back where?" he said. The oldest girl's jaw tightened. "You know where." "I don't," Silas said. "I'm a rancher. I live across that field. I heard something and came to check." She didn't believe him. He could see that. Whatever they'd been through, whoever had been looking for them, trust wasn't something she had left to spend on a stranger with a lantern. He crouched down to lower his height. It put him below her eye level, which he figured was the point. "What's your name?" he said. A pause, long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. "Clara," she said. "Clara Voss." "Silas Mercer." He nodded toward the small boy. "His feet are bad. I've got a warm fire and food. That's all I'm offering." "And what do you want for it?" The question landed flat and serious, and it made something twist in him because it was the question of a person who'd learned that nothing came without a price. 14 years old, maybe, and already she knew that. "Nothing," he said. She stared at him. "I want nothing for it," he said again. "You don't owe me anything. The boy's feet are bad, come or don't. But if you stay here tonight, some of these little ones won't make morning." Clara looked down at the boy with the wrapped feet. Her throat moved. She looked back at Silas, and for just a second the calculating expression cracked, and underneath it he saw something exhausted and frightened and achingly young. "If you're lying," she said quietly, "I will find a way to make you sorry." Silas stood up. "Fair enough," he said. "Stay close. Wind's bad. Tut-tut." Getting them across the field was the hardest thing he'd done in years, and he'd done some hard things. He carried the youngest boy, the one with the wrapped feet, whose name turned out to be Thomas, though Clara said it like a warning when she told him, like she was giving Silas something valuable and dangerous. And the child weighed almost nothing, which was its own kind of terrible. The others moved in a cluster, Clara at the back, the rest pressed together against the wind, and Silas led them with the lantern and tried to keep them moving without pushing too hard because 2 of the smaller ones were stumbling. They didn't talk. There wasn't breath to spare. When he finally got the barn door open and pushed them inside out of the wind, he heard 3 of them start crying almost simultaneously. Not loud, but the helpless kind that comes when the body finally stops holding itself together because it's someplace that might be safe. He got them into the cabin, got the fire built up, got blankets from the chest in the bedroom, and then stood in his own kitchen watching 6 children he'd never seen before in his life crowding around his fireplace like they were trying to absorb every BTU it had. He got the cookpot out. Salt pork, beans, what cornbread he had left from 2 days ago. He heated it without thinking about it, just moving around his kitchen doing the things that needed doing. Clara sat apart from the others, watching him. She'd taken the blanket he offered, but hadn't wrapped it around herself. She'd wrapped it around a small girl named May, who was 7 and had been shaking so hard her teeth clicked together. Clara herself sat with her arms crossed, back straight, watching Silas's every move. "How long were you in that cabin?" he said, not looking at her while he stirred the pot. 2 nights. 2 nights. He let that sit. "Where'd you come from?" She didn't answer immediately. "The mountains," she said. He nodded like that told him something, which it didn't, but he wasn't going to push. Not tonight. Tonight was food and warmth and sleep, Everything else could wait until they weren't blue around the lips. He served the food in whatever bowls and tin cups he had, which wasn't 6, so he improvised with a pot lid and a wooden serving bowl he'd never actually used for serving. None of the children said anything when he handed them food. They just ate. Fast, careful, all of them keeping their elbows in the way people do when they're used to food disappearing if you don't protect it, and that told him something too. Thomas had fallen asleep before his food was half gone. Silas gently took the bowl from his hands and set it aside and pulled the blanket up around him. Clara watched him do it. "The people looking for you," Silas said. He went back to standing by the stove. "They're coming to this valley." Her face changed, just slightly, a tightening. "Probably," she said. "You want to tell me who they are?" She was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked. One of the smaller children, a boy named Eli, maybe 10, had fallen sideways against another child and was asleep, still holding his cup. "A man named Blackwood," Clara said finally. Her voice went flat when she said the name, the way voices go flat when a word has too much behind it to carry any expression. "Edgar Blackwood. He owns mines, up in the high country." She paused. "He owned us too. That's how he thinks of it." Silas looked at her. Owned. "We worked his tunnels, all of us." Her eyes moved to the sleeping children and then back to him. "Some of the others didn't make it out." He didn't say anything to that. He didn't have anything to say that would be worth the air it cost. "He'll send men," Clara said. "He always sends men. He's done it before, when others tried to run." Something moved through her expression. "They didn't get away." "You did," Silas said. She looked at him steadily. "So far." He gave them his bedroom. All 6 of them, which meant they were sleeping in configurations that made no architectural sense, but they arranged themselves with the pragmatic efficiency of people who were used to sharing small spaces and just went to sleep. Clara took the floor by the door. He offered her the bed. She declined without discussion. He took the chair by the fire. He sat there for a long time after the cabin went quiet, listening to the storm outside and the breathing of 6 children behind the closed bedroom door, and he tried to think clearly about what he'd done. He'd brought them here. That was the first fact. 6 children running from a man with money and reach and armed men working for him, and Silas had brought them into his home and fed them and put them to bed, and come morning, whoever Blackwood had sent into this valley would be able to follow tracks. Snow was deep, but the cabin trail was well worn, and there were 6 children who couldn't move fast and 1 adult who couldn't leave them. He should have, what? Left them? The thought arrived and he examined it the way you'd pick up a piece of bad meat. Left Thomas with the frozen feet in an abandoned cabin. Left Clara standing in front of the others with blood dried on her face, calculating whether a stranger with a lantern was another threat to put between herself and the smaller ones. No. He'd never had that choice. Not really. Some things don't allow options. He'd known that the moment he'd seen the boy's feet. What he had now was a problem. A serious one. He reached over and added wood to the fire, watching the sparks jump. He thought about Edgar Blackwood, a name he'd never heard, which meant either the man operated carefully or Silas had spent too many years buried in this valley, paying no attention to what moved in the high country above him. Probably both. He thought about the way Clara had said he owned us, with no drama in it, just flat acknowledgement of a reality that had been true long enough to stop feeling like an outrage and start feeling like weather. He thought about the children who hadn't made it out. Outside, the storm was easing a little, still coming down, but the worst of the wind had moved through. By morning, it would be clear, and tracks would hold in the cold, and whoever was in this valley looking for 6 children and leaving a trail would have his door to consider. Silas sat up in the chair, elbows on knees, and stared into the fire. He'd spent 5 years in this valley in retreat. From grief. From the world that had taken his wife and his daughter in the same fever winter and left him with nothing to do with himself except put one day after another until the days added up to something that resembled a life. He'd gotten very good at not mattering, at being invisible, at being a man who had nothing anyone would want to take and therefore nothing anyone would come for. That was done now. He'd picked up a lamp and walked out into a blizzard, and whatever came next was going to come regardless of how much he wanted to be left alone. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the dark. The snow was tapering. Stars were starting to show through, and the half-moon threw blue light over the white expanse of his field, and everything was very quiet and very cold and very still. Somewhere in the high country, Edgar Blackwood had men moving through that dark. Silas turned from the window and went to check that his rifle was loaded. It was. He sat back down in the chair. He didn't sleep, but he stayed warm and the fire held, and from behind the bedroom door he could hear 6 children breathing, slow and even and safe, for now. And that was something. That was, he thought, maybe everything. He sat with that until morning came gray and cold and clean over the mountains, and then he put on the coffee and started figuring out what came next. The coffee was done before any of the children stirred. Silas sat at the table with his second cup and watched the light come up over the eastern ridge, turning the snow from blue to gray to a hard, flat white that hurt to look at directly. The storm had moved through clean, the way mountain storms sometimes did, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost aggressive. Every sound carried farther than it should. The creak of the cabin settling, Cutter shifting his weight in the barn, his own breathing. He'd been thinking since before dawn, and what he'd arrived at wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. Get the children fed. Get Thomas's feet looked at. Figure out where things stood before whoever Blackwood sent came to find out. He heard the bedroom door open. Clara came out first. She'd slept in her clothes, which made sense, and her hair had come most of the way out of whatever she'd tied it with the night before, and there was still dried blood above her eye that he hadn't been able to convince her to let him clean last night. She stopped when she saw him sitting there, and her whole body went briefly tense before she recognized him and let it out. "Sit down," he said. "Coffee's hot." She sat across the table from him, and he poured her a cup, and she wrapped both hands around it and looked at him over the rim with those measuring eyes that he was starting to understand were just how she was. Not suspicious of him specifically, suspicious of everything. He couldn't argue with the logic. "How's Thomas?" he said. "Still sleeping. His feet look bad. The left one especially." She paused. "Are you a doctor?" "No." "Do you know anything about frostbite?" "Some." He'd seen it on men in the field during his scouting years, which wasn't the same as treating it, but it was more than nothing. "I'll look at him when he wakes up. I've got some things that might help." Clara nodded. She drank her coffee. Outside, something moved across the snow. A hawk, low and hunting, and her eyes tracked it through the window automatically, reflexively, the way a person watches movement when they've been conditioned to treat movement as threat. "You should know," she said, not looking away from the window, "that I meant what I said last night, about not going back." "I know you did." "I'm not saying that to be difficult." Now she looked at him. "I'm saying it because whatever you're thinking about doing, turning us in, making some kind of arrangement with Blackwood's people, it won't work the way you think. He doesn't make arrangements. He just takes what he wants and removes whatever's in his way." Silas set down his cup. "I wasn't thinking about doing either of those things." She watched him. "I was thinking about breakfast," he said, "and then thinking about your brother's feet, and then thinking about what direction trouble's going to come from and how much time we've got." He stood up and went to the stove. "You want to help me, or you want to keep watching me like I might pull a knife out?" A pause. "Both," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair." The others woke up in pieces over the next hour, emerging from the bedroom with the disoriented wariness of people who'd learned not to trust that safety held from one moment to the next. Silas made porridge. It wasn't much. Oats, a little dried apple, what honey he had left in the crock, but he made enough, and he watched their faces when they sat down to eat, the way they checked the exits first without even thinking about it, the way May tucked her knees up under herself on the chair like she was trying to take up less space, the way Eli ate with one hand while the other rested on the table, ready to push back from it. He'd been doing this kind of reading his whole working life, assessing people, situations, threat levels. And what he read in these children sat in his chest like cold metal. Thomas's feet were worse than he'd hoped. The left foot especially had the shiny, blotchy look that meant the cold had done real damage. Not black, not the worst of it, but bad enough that the boy cried quietly when Silas unwrapped the cloth and examined him, trying hard not to and mostly failing. "You're not in trouble," Silas told him. "Crying doesn't bother me." Thomas was maybe 6. He had brown eyes and a bruise along his jaw that was a week old and turning yellow. He looked at Silas with an expression that was trying to be brave and not quite managing it. "Does it need to come off?" he asked. "The foot?" The directness of the question, a 6-year-old asking if he was going to lose his foot the way another child might ask if it was going to rain, made Silas stop for a second. "No," he said, and meant it. "It's going to hurt for a while, but no." He cleaned the foot carefully, applied what he had, a drawing salve his wife had made from a recipe her mother gave her, that he'd kept because throwing it away felt like losing something, and wrapped it in clean cloth. He kept his hands steady and his face neutral. And when Thomas finally went limp with exhaustion and fell back asleep on the settle, Clara was standing in the doorway watching. "Thank you," she said. Just that, flat and honest. "Don't mention it," Silas said, and cleaned up the kit. He got the full story in pieces over that first day and the days that followed, because Clara wasn't the kind of person who told you everything at once, and he wasn't the kind of person who pushed. The others added to it in fragments, Eli letting something slip over the woodpile, May saying something in her sleep that Clara quickly talked over, one of the older boys, Danny, going quiet in a particular way when Silas asked where they'd all come from originally that said more than any answer would have. Here was what he assembled. Edgar Blackwood ran 3 mining operations in the high country northeast of Silas's valley. Silver, primarily, with some copper in the lower shafts. The official story, the story that made it into newspapers and county records, and the comfortable conversations of men in suits in Denver, was that Blackwood Mining employed laborers at competitive wages, operated clean and safe facilities, and was a model of frontier enterprise. The truth of it was something else entirely. The children came from various places and various disasters, orphaned by illness or accidents, given up by families too broke to feed them, taken from institutions that were happy to have someone else deal with the paperwork. Blackwood had arrangements with people in several counties, men who identified likely candidates and moved them quietly into the system. Once inside, there was no paperwork that helped you get out. There were only the tunnels. The tunnels were where you worked, 12, 14 hours. The small ones were useful because they could get into passages the grown men couldn't, pushing their carts through spaces where an adult couldn't stand upright. They learned not to complain about the air. They learned not to ask about wages because the wages went toward your keep, Blackwood's man, Mr. Pruitt, explained, toward the cost of your food and your bunk and your clothes, and the math of it always came out to you owing more than you'd earned, somehow, every week, which meant you could never leave because you couldn't leave with a debt unpaid. That wasn't how honest people operated. "How long were you there?" Silas asked Clara one evening. They were at the table while the younger children slept, and he'd asked the question quietly, not sure he'd get an answer. She thought about it, not like she was deciding whether to tell him, but like she was genuinely calculating. 3 years, she said. "I was 11 when they brought me in." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Thomas wasn't there when I got there. He came about a year later. He was 5. 5. Silas kept his face still. "They brought children that young?" "The small tunnels," she said simply, and he understood and wished he didn't. "How did you get out?" This was the part that came out slowly over several evenings, and when he had all of it assembled, he had a genuine respect for what she'd done. She'd spent months planning it, learning the routines of the men who guarded the compound, which ones drank, which ones slept at the wrong times, which path down the mountain was watched, and which one wasn't. She'd organized the 6 who came with her based on who could move fast, who was small enough to fit through the gap in the north fence she'd identified. She'd stolen food in small amounts over weeks, hiding it in a place no one would look. They'd gone on a night with no moon in November, which was a terrible time to attempt a mountain escape, but also the time when the guards were least vigilant because they figured no one would be stupid enough to try it. Claire had figured that was exactly the reason to try it then. They'd walked 4 days through the high country before the storm caught them. "You lost anyone?" Silas asked. "No," she said, and the way she said it, the weight in it, the responsibility in it, told him that had been the thing she'd been most afraid of, not getting caught, losing one of them. He sat with that for a moment. "The others," he said carefully, "the ones who were still there, when you left." Her face didn't change much, but her hands tightened around the cup. 14, she said. "There were 14 others, children." A pause. "There were more before," But some of them, she stopped. You don't have to. 2 years ago, she said, there was an accident in Tunnel 7. 3 of the older boys were killed. Blackwood's man filed a report with the county office saying they were adult workers who'd come from out of state and had no family. She looked at the table. Nobody asked questions. Silas stood up and went to the window because he needed somewhere to put what he was feeling. And the feeling was the kind that sat in the hands, the kind that wanted to close into something and hit. He stood there until it passed into something colder and more useful. Blackwood's going to send people here, he said. Yes. How many? He has 6 full-time men, armed, plus whatever local help he can buy, and he can buy a lot. She paused. The county sheriff in Holt is on his payroll. Marshal Deeds, too, probably. He's been buying influence for years. You know this, or you think this? I know the sheriff. He came to the compound twice while I was there. Blackwood poured him whiskey, and they shook hands, and one of the times I was cleaning the main house, and I heard Deeds tell Blackwood that a family in the valley had asked questions about some missing children, and Blackwood said to deal with it quietly, and Deeds said he would. She looked at Silas steadily. I don't know what happened to that family. The fire popped. One of the children turned over on the settle, murmuring something, and Clara's eyes went to them automatically and then back. I need to write some letters, Silas said. She frowned. Letters? I was a scout for 8 years, federal contract. I know people. Some of them are in places where a letter from me might actually get opened. He turned from the window. I'm not going to just sit here and wait for Blackwood's men to ride up. Letters take weeks. I know. He might be here in days. I know that too. He sat back down across from her. So we need to be ready for both, the men who might come soon and the process that might help later. He looked at her. But here's what I need to know first. All of you. Can you tell me what you saw? Not just what you know or what you think. What you saw, specifically. What you could testify to. Claire's expression shifted, something moving through it that he couldn't quite name. Then she straightened in her chair. Yes, she said. All of us. Even Thomas saw things. I tried to keep him from it, but she stopped. Yes. Silas nodded. All right. Is that what we're doing? She said. Testifying? Someday, hopefully. If we can get to that point. He was quiet for a moment. But first I need to know if you trust me enough to let me help you properly. Not just feed you and keep you warm. Actually help. She looked at him for a long time. The fire threw light across her face, catching the scar along her cheekbone that he'd noticed on the second day. Older than the cut above her eye. Something that had healed wrong, pink and tight. I trusted my instincts to get us out of those mountains, she said finally, and my instincts said come with you. That's not an answer. It's the closest I've got right now, she said. Don't push it. He didn't. Marchen. On the 4th day, Cutter started acting up. The mule was in the corral when it happened. Mid-morning, clear sky, Silas splitting wood at the block, while Danny and Eli stacked it, the first real work he'd given the older boys, and they'd taken to it with an energy that came from needing something to do with their bodies. Cutter suddenly stopped moving around the corral and faced northeast, ears forward, head high, every muscle in him reading the distance. Silas put down the axe. Get inside, he said quietly. Danny looked up. Now, both of you, inside and stay there. They went without argument, which told him something about how their instincts had been shaped, and Silas picked up the rifle he'd left leaning against the woodpile and moved to the corner of the barn where he could see the northeast trail without being easily seen himself. 2 riders. Coming down slow, which was either casual or careful, and he didn't think it was casual. They came into the yard and stopped at a distance that said they'd done this kind of thing before, far enough that a man with a rifle at the door would have to work at the shot, close enough to talk. Both of them wore good coats and bad expressions. The one on the left had a deputy's star on his chest that caught the sun. Silas Mercer? The one with the star called out. Who's asking? Deputy Ellis Cole, out of Holt. He touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, the gesture of a man going through motions. We're looking for some children, runaways from a work program up north. Word is you might have seen something. Silas stepped out from the barn corner so they could see him clearly, Rifle down, but not slung. Work program, he said. That's right, Mr. Blackwood's operation. The children are wards of the program. Legal placement, all documented. Cole's voice was smooth in a rehearsed way. He's worried about their safety. Terrible weather recently. Terrible weather, Silas said. Are you going to keep repeating what I say, or are you going to answer the question? Silas considered the two men. Cole, with his rehearsed concern and borrowed authority. The second man who hadn't said anything, who sat on his horse with his right hand at a particular angle that wasn't exactly reaching for his weapon, but wasn't away from it either. I haven't seen any children, Silas said. Cole's expression didn't change much, but something behind it did. You mind if we take a look around? I do mind, Silas said. You got a paper that says otherwise? A pause. Mr. Mercer, we're trying to... You got a warrant or a court order? Silas kept his voice level. Because a deputy's badge doesn't give you the right to walk through a man's property without one. Last I checked. You want to come back with paper? I'll look at the paper. Till then, I'd appreciate if you turned around. Cole stared at him. The second man's hand shifted slightly. We'll be back, Cole said. I expect you will, Silas said. He stood in the yard and watched them ride back up the northeast trail until they were out of sight. Then he stood there a while longer because he'd learned that men sometimes doubled back. When he finally went inside, all 6 children were in the main room, Clara in front of the others in the same posture as the night he'd found them, arms out slightly at her sides. Her eyes searched his face. 2 men, he said. They're gone for now. Cole, she said immediately. Deputy Ellis Cole? That's the one. Something moved through her face. Not surprise. Confirmation. He came to the compound twice. I know. He knew what it was, she said. He knew what was happening there. He looked at us. Her voice didn't rise, which somehow made it worse. He looked right at us and had lunch with Blackwood and rode away. Silas set the rifle on the table. He'll be back with more of them, he said. And they'll have paperwork that looks right, even if it isn't. He looked at Clara. I need to send those letters today. Is there anything you remember? See, names of men who died in the tunnels, specific dates, things Blackwood or his people said that you can put words to? Anything specific that you haven't told me yet? She sat down at the table and looked at her hands for a moment. Get paper, she said. He got paper. She talked for 2 hours. Dates, names, specific statements she'd heard through doors and thin walls. The names of the 3 boys who died in Tunnel 7, James Arlo, 14, Peter Hatch, 13, Samuel Webb, also 13. And the name of the man who'd filed the false report, a name she'd overheard Blackwood use in a conversation through a half-open door, a man in Denver connected to land and court records who'd helped make the whole operation invisible on paper. Silas wrote everything down in his cramped, careful hand, and when she was done, he sealed the letter and 2 copies and wrote 3 separate addresses. Federal Marshal's office in Denver, he said, writing the first. A judge I did work for in 71, and a man named Hargrove who runs a newspaper that doesn't love being told what to print. Clara watched him. You think any of them will come? She said. I think some of them will, he said. If I get these out before Blackwood's people decide to stop letting mail leave this valley. He stood up. I'm going to ride to Gunnison myself tonight and put these in a federal mail bag. Not local, federal. She frowned. You'd leave us alone? Just through the night. I'll be back by morning. He looked at her. Can you handle that? She sat with it for a moment and he could see her running through it. The risk of him being gone, the risk of him not sending the letters, the calculations she was always making. Take Danny with you, she said. He's the fastest rider. I was going alone specifically so nobody could follow him back. Then she stopped herself, and he saw the thing she was fighting, the control she wanted, the trust she didn't quite have enough of, the understanding that there were things she couldn't manage from this room, no matter how hard she tried. Fine, she said. Go. You've got the rifle under the settle and the shotgun above the door, he said. You know how to use either of those? She looked at him flatly. Which one do you want? He said. The rifle, she said. Obviously. He almost smiled again. He was almost smiling a lot lately. He wasn't sure what to do with that. He left at dusk and rode hard through a cold that bit at every exposed inch of skin, and he made Gunnison by 10 o'clock and pushed the letters into the federal bag himself, watching the postmaster seal it. He was back on the road before midnight, riding home through the dark, through the blue-lit snow and the pine smell and the long, empty silence of the mountains. He thought about what Clara had said. He looked right at us, and the flatness in her voice when she said it. The way accusation and acceptance had gotten mixed together in it until they were almost the same thing. He thought about James Arlo and Peter Hatch and Samuel Webb, who were 13 and 14 years old, and whose names were in a sealed envelope now moving toward Denver, and who deserved at minimum that someone knew their names were real. He rode faster. When he came up the trail toward the ranch, the lamp was burning in the window, and the shadow that moved behind it was Clara's. He could tell by the height, by the posture. Doing what he'd been doing 5 nights ago, watching the dark for movement. He put Cutter in the barn and went inside, stomping snow from his boots. Clara was at the window. She turned around when he came in. "Letters sent?" she said. "Letters sent." She nodded once. She looked like she'd been awake the whole time, which she probably had. "Thomas's fever broke," she said. "An hour ago." "Good," Silas said. "The others are sleeping." "Good." She looked at him for a moment, and he thought she might say something. Something about the letters, or coal, or what came next. Instead, she just picked up the rifle from where she'd had it beside the window and held it out to him. He took it. "Get some sleep," he said. She went to the bedroom. He went to the chair by the fire. Outside, the night was quiet and enormous and cold. And somewhere in the mountains above them, Edgar Blackwood had 6 men and a great deal of money, and the kind of patience that came from never having needed to be in a hurry before. The letters were on their way to Denver. Cole and his companion had been back and hadn't gotten what they came for. The children were inside and the fire was going, and Thomas's fever had broken. It was something. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Silas sat in the chair and watched the fire and waited for morning, and in the morning he would start figuring out what came after that. The ranch needed fortifying. The children needed to know where to go if men came through the door. There were preparations to make and not much time to make them. He didn't sleep, but he sat still and the fire held, and that had to be enough for tonight. The letters had been gone 11 days when Blackwood came himself. Silas had been expecting it, not hoping for it, not dreading it in a way that paralyzed him, just expecting it the way you expect bad weather when you've been watching the sky long enough. The signs had been accumulating. Cole had ridden past the property twice more in the past week, not stopping, not announcing himself, just present in that particular way that meant someone wanted you to know you were being watched. A man Silas didn't recognize had spent an afternoon near the South Ridge with a horse and no apparent purpose. And 3 days ago, Danny had come in from the woodline saying he'd seen dust on the high trail, the kind of dust that meant more than 2 riders. Silas had used those 11 days. He'd moved the children's sleeping arrangement so that the bedroom had 2 exits. One through the window he'd cut the warped frame loose from, which now opened silently, dropping to a snowbank on the east side of the cabin. He'd spent 2 full days fortifying what he could fortify. Not enough, and he knew it, but the south-facing wall of the barn now had firing gaps cut between the logs at the right height, and the root cellar under the cabin had enough food and water and blankets to keep 6 children alive for 3 days if it came to that. He'd shown Clara the cellar. He'd shown her the window. He'd shown Danny and Eli, the oldest boys, 14 and 12, where the extra ammunition was and how to reload the shotgun, which neither of them should have needed to know how to do, and both of them learned without a word of complaint. He'd shown Clara how to operate the rifle properly, though it turned out she'd already known the basics, picked up from watching the compound guards. He corrected her grip and her stance and her trigger discipline, and she absorbed the corrections the way she absorbed everything, seriously, without ego, focused on function. "You're not bad," he told her on the 3rd day of practice, shooting at a tin he'd hung from the fence post 40 yards out. "I hit it twice out of 6, she said. "You hit it twice out of 6 on day 3. She lowered the rifle and looked at the tin, calculating. "How many times can you hit it?" 6 out of 6, he said. She handed him the rifle. "Then you shoot," she said, which was probably the right call. On the morning of the 12th day, Cutter stopped moving again. Silas was at the window before the riders came into view. He counted them as they came down the northeast trail. 6 men, then a seventh, then an eighth, and they were spread across the trail in a way that was deliberate, not bunched together the way casual riders grouped. Behind them, on a dark horse that was better than anything else in the group by a clear margin, came a ninth man in a gray coat. He'd never seen Edgar Blackwood before, but he knew him immediately, the way you sometimes know a thing, by the way the men arranged themselves around him without being instructed to, by the way he rode with the specific patience of someone who expected the world to wait for him. Silas went to the bedroom door. "Cellar," he said. "All of you. Clara, you stay." He heard the immediate rustle of children moving, Clara's voice low and firm giving instructions. He went back to the window. They were crossing into his yard now, spreading out in a loose arc. Two of them angled toward the barn. "Hey!" he called, opening the door. "Those two stop where they are." The two men heading for the barn pulled up. Blackwood came forward a few yards on his horse and stopped. He was somewhere around 50, square-faced, with a gray mustache trimmed neat, and eyes that were pale enough to be unsettling in certain light. He was dressed well for a frontier ride. Not flashy, but expensive in the careful, understated way of a man who didn't need to announce what he had. "Mr. Mercer," he said. Not a question. "That's right. My name is Edgar Blackwood. I operate mining interests in this region." He said it calmly, like he was introducing himself at a dinner. "I believe we have something to discuss." "We might," Silas said. He was standing in the doorway with the rifle in his hands, not raised, not threatening, just present. "Though you've brought a lot of men for a discussion." Blackwood glanced at his riders. "I've had some difficulty recently with people taking what belongs to me," he said. "I've learned to take precautions." "What belongs to you?" Silas said. "The children," Blackwood said, the warmth in his voice so practiced it was almost convincing. "They're wards of my operation. I have documentation. Legal placement papers for each of them, filed properly with county records." He reached into his coat and produced a folded set of papers. "I'm happy to have you look these over. I want this resolved peacefully." Silas didn't move from the doorway. Behind him, he heard Clara step up close. He hadn't told her to stay back, but he hadn't told her to come forward either. She came and stood at his left shoulder, and he felt rather than saw the effect it had on Blackwood, the slight adjustment in his expression, the recalibration. "Clara Voss," Blackwood said, and something about the way he said her name made Silas's hand tighten on the rifle. Not her name exactly, but what was in it, the familiarity of ownership. "You've caused a great deal of trouble." "Yes, sir," Clara said, flat and even. "I expect I have." Blackwood looked at her for a moment, then back at Silas. "I'm not an unreasonable man, Mr. Mercer. You found some runaways in a storm and took them in. That's a decent thing, but they have a legal status and a legal obligation, and I have every right under current law to collect them and return them to the program." He extended the papers toward one of his men, who rode forward a few steps to offer them to Silas. "Read it yourself." Silas took the papers. He looked at them. Not long, but enough. They were professional. Names, dates, signatures, county seals. Someone had spent time on these, someone good at producing paperwork that looked right. "I'll need a few days to have a lawyer look at these," he said, handing them back. Something shifted in Blackwood's eyes. "I'm afraid I'm not prepared to wait a few days." "Then we have a problem." The yard went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of the valley in the mornings, but the drawn-tight quiet of men waiting to see which way something was going to break. "Mr. Mercer," Blackwood said, and the dinner party pleasantness was gone now, replaced with something that had been underneath it all along. "I've dealt with this type of situation before. Men who think their property line means something when I have legal authority. It never ends well for the property owner." He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "I have 8 men with me. I have a deputy's endorsement from the county, and I have the patience of a man who always gets what he comes for. Now, are you going to do this the easy way, or are you going to make me demonstrate why the easy way is preferable?" Silas looked at him. Then he stepped back and closed the door. "Cellar," he said to Clara, "right now." Silas, the older boys too, everyone in the cellar. He was already moving, taking the rifle to the south window, checking the yard. The men outside were repositioning. He could see it happening, the casual spread becoming something more tactical. "Go, now." "What are you going to do?" "Hold the line until someone smarter than me figures out what to do legally." He looked at her. Clara, I need you underground with those kids. That's the most important thing that happens today. She stood there for 1 second. One long second where he could see her wanting to argue, wanting to stay, wanting to be in the room where things happened instead of the room where you waited. Then she went. He heard the cellar hatch open and feet on the ladder and Clara's voice below, calm, holding everyone together. He went back to the window. They came at the barn first. 2 men broke from the group and moved toward the barn doors at a pace that was too fast for casual and too coordinated to be spontaneous, and Silas read it correctly. They were going to come through the barn and into the cabin from the back, standard enough, and he wasn't going to be able to stop both approaches at once. He did something that felt stupid and right simultaneously. He opened the front door again and stepped out onto the porch. "I'm going to fire into the air," he said, loud enough to carry across the yard. "1 shot, then I'm going to reload, and the next one won't be in the air. I want everybody to be clear on that before anything happens that can't be undone." He fired into the sky. The sound cracked off the ridge and came back twice. Everything stopped. Blackwood's horse shifted under him. He steadied it with one hand and looked at Silas with an expression that had moved past irritation into something colder. "That was a mistake," Blackwood said. "Probably," Silas said, "but I sleep better making my own mistakes than other people's good decisions." He was watching the 2 men near the barn. They'd stopped, watching Blackwood for a signal. Blackwood hadn't given it yet, which told Silas something. Blackwood preferred to be clean about this, preferred the paperwork and the deputy's word over outright violence if he could manage it, because outright violence had a way of creating complications. Even money couldn't smooth over. "Last offer," Blackwood said. "The children come with me. You face no charges. We go our separate ways, and you never hear from me again. And if I say no, then my men come through your door." Silas reloaded, slowly, deliberately, making sure Blackwood watched him do it. "I've got letters in the Federal mail," Silas said. "Filed 11 days ago. Judge Harlan Crest in Denver, Federal Marshal's office, and a man named Hargrove at the Territorial Press." He watched Blackwood's face. "Those letters have names in them, dates. The names of 3 boys who died in Tunnel 7 and were filed as adult workers from out of state." He paused. "James Arlo, Peter Hatch, Samuel Webb." He said the names deliberately, watching. Something happened in Blackwood's face. Not guilt. He didn't think the man did guilt, but calculation, fast and cold, running through implications. "You've been busy," Blackwood said. "I had 11 days. Letters can be lost. These ones are already in Denver." That was a partial truth. He didn't know for certain they'd arrived, but they'd gone into a federal bag from a federal office, and the odds were in his favor, and a partial truth delivered with confidence was sometimes all you had. Blackwood looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the cabin. Then back. "Take them," he said to his men. "Go on." They came through both doors simultaneously, front and back, the barn through the back team moving the moment Blackwood gave the word. And Silas had maybe 2 seconds of advantage from expecting it before the front door came in. He put the first man through the front door on the floor with the rifle stock. Not shot, hit, hard across the shoulder. And that bought him the time to put the rifle down and take the fight into the cramped space of the main room, where rifles were a liability and size and commitment were the currency. He'd been in enough bad situations to understand that the worst thing you could do in close quarters was hesitate. He didn't hesitate. The second man through the front was bigger, and they went into the table and broke it, and Silas caught an elbow in the cheekbone that lit up his vision for a second. He got his forearm into the man's throat and used the wall, and the man went down gasping, and Silas turned to find 2 more coming through from the back. He got the rifle back up. "Stop," he said. They stopped. One of them, younger, maybe 22, 23, had the look of a man who hadn't quite signed up for this specific version of events. The man on the floor with the rifle stock bruise was trying to get up. Silas stepped on his hand, not hard, just informative. "Stay down," he said, and the man stayed. It was a standoff of the specific kind that never lasts. 6 men outside, 2 in the room, 1 under his foot, and himself. And he had maybe 30 seconds before somebody made a decision that collapsed all of this into something he couldn't control. A shot came through the window, not at him. It hit the wall high, deliberately high, which was either a warning or extremely bad marksmanship. The sound in the enclosed space was enormous, and one of the men from the back flinched and moved wrong, and Silas moved with that, using it, getting to the far wall where he had both doorways in front of him. Then, from outside, he heard something that wasn't one of Blackwood's men, a voice. Authoritative and carrying and coming from the direction of the Northeast Trail, from outside the yard, from behind Blackwood's group. Nobody move. Federal Marshal's office. Every man in that yard, put your hands where I can see them. The silence that followed was the most complete silence Silas had heard in years. He moved to the window carefully and looked. 3 men at the north edge of the yard, badges visible even from the distance. Behind them, 4 more spreading out along the fence line. One of them, older, broad through the shoulders, a gray hat, was sitting on a horse directly behind Blackwood with a rifle leveled at an angle that made his intentions very clear. Silas let out a breath. He turned around. The 2 men from the back were looking at each other. The man on the floor had stopped trying to get up. I'd recommend, Silas said, doing exactly what the man said. It took the better part of an hour to sort out the yard, and it was not a clean process. 2 of Blackwood's men tried to ride for it and were cut off by the marshals who'd come in from the south, a direction nobody had thought to watch. Deputy Cole, who had apparently ridden out with Blackwood's group as legal cover, tried to produce his badge and his papers and explain himself to the federal men, who were unimpressed by county papers and unimpressed by Cole, and told him so at considerable length while another marshal held his horse. Blackwood himself did not run. That surprised Silas, and then it didn't. Running was for men who thought they might lose. Blackwood, even cuffed on his horse in the center of his own disaster, looked like a man who was already calculating the next move, running probabilities, deciding which of his arrangements in Denver might still hold. The lead marshal was named Elias Drummond. He was 50-something and had the weathered, unhurried manner of a man who'd seen everything twice and had opinions about none of it. He came to Silas's porch once his men had the situation controlled and extended a hand. "Mr. Mercer." Silas shook it. His cheekbone was swelling where the elbow had landed, and his right hand wasn't working perfectly. He'd jammed 2 fingers on the wall, but he was upright, which was the main thing. "You got here faster than I expected," Silas said. "Judge Crest sent us same day he received your letter. Said your name and said if you wrote a letter like that, something was very wrong." Drummond looked at the yard. "Appears he was right." He paused. "How many children?" 6. "They're below." Drummond nodded. "I'll need to speak with them. Not today. Today they should rest. But we'll need statements." He looked at Silas steadily. "What you've got here, the names you sent, the information about the tunnel deaths, that's a federal matter. Trafficking, forced labor, falsified documents. This goes well beyond a county dispute." He paused. "I need the children to talk." "They'll talk," Silas said. He thought about Clara saying yes, all of us. The oldest one especially. She's been holding this for 3 years. Drummond looked at the cabin door. "Go get them," he said. "I'll have my men clear the yard first. I'd rather they don't come out to that." Silas went to the cellar hatch. He knocked twice, the signal he'd established, and lifted it. 6 faces looked up from the dark below. Thomas's was the first one. He was sitting closest to the ladder with his wrapped foot stretched out in front of him, and his expression when he saw it was Silas above him was something Silas was not going to think about too carefully right now, because there was still work to do. "It's clear," Silas said. "Federal marshals. They've got Blackwood." A sound came up from the cellar that he didn't have a word for. Not a cheer, not a sob. Something between the two, a release of pressure that 6 people had been holding collectively. Clara was the last one up. She came through the hatch and stood in the main room and looked at the broken table and the damage to the front door and the blood on the floor from the man who'd taken the rifle stock. "Are you hurt?" she said, looking at his face. "Nothing serious." She looked at him in a way that said she knew the difference between nothing serious and nothing, but she let it go. "They've got him," Silas said. "I heard." She was quiet for a moment. "Is it over?" He thought about Drummond's face. He thought about Blackwood's face. That cold calculation, even in cuffs. He thought about lawyers in Denver and documents filed in county offices, and a man with enough money and enough connections to have built what he'd built without anyone stopping him for years. This part is, he said. She looked at him. The harder part, he said, is going to be the courtroom. Clara straightened her spine. That thing she did, that particular gathering of herself, and nodded once. All right, she said. May had come to stand beside her, and Clara put an arm around the smaller girl automatically, without looking down. The way you do with someone you've been protecting so long, the motion is muscle memory. Thomas was sitting on the settle with his wrapped foot, watching Silas with the absolute confidence of a 6-year-old who has decided that a particular adult is trustworthy, which Silas found harder to bear than the fight. Outside, Drummond's men were moving Blackwood's riders toward the trail, voices carrying in the cold air, horses blowing steam in the late afternoon light. Silas went to the stove. The coffee from this morning was long cold, but the fire was still going, and he put more wood on it and got the pot going again because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. And 6 children and 3 federal marshals were all going to be in this cabin before nightfall, and somebody had to think about whether there was enough food. "Danny," he said. The 14-year-old looked up from where he'd stationed himself near the window, watching the yard. "I need you to go count what's in the larder and tell me what we've got." Danny looked at him for a second. The specific look of a boy who'd been given responsibility by an adult and wasn't sure if it was real or just something to make him feel useful. Then he went to the larder and started counting. Eli was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his knees up, and he looked, for the first time since Silas had known him, like a 12-year-old boy. Not a child who'd been through a tunnel for 2 years. Just a kid, leaning against a wall, processing the fact that the thing he'd been running from was outside in handcuffs. Clara stayed by the window, watching the yard, until Blackwood was taken out of sight up the trail. Only then did she sit down. She sat at the edge of the settle, back straight, hands in her lap, and Silas watched her face do something private, some internal accounting, some checking of a column that had been running for a long time, finally arriving at a number. He looked away because some things a person deserved to do without being watched. The fire came up. The cabin warmed. Outside, the sun was dropping behind the western ridge and throwing long shadows across the snow, and the valley was quieter than it had been in almost 2 weeks. 14, Danny said from the larder, appearing in the doorway. 14 things. Is that enough? We'll make it enough, Silas said. He started pulling things down from the shelf. The marshals came in an hour later, stomping snow from their boots, and Drummond looked around the cabin with the practiced eye of a man assessing a situation. And what he assessed seemed to settle something in him. 6 children, 1 man, a broken table, a going fire, and something in the air that wasn't exactly calm, but was close enough to it that the difference didn't much matter. We'll camp outside tonight, Drummond told Silas. 2 men on watch. You and the children stay inside. He looked at the 6 faces watching him from various positions around the room. He wasn't a man given to softness, you could see that, but something in his expression adjusted. You're safe tonight, he said. Not to Silas, to the room. I give you my word on that. May, who hadn't spoken to any adult outside of Silas and Clara since they'd arrived, looked up from where she was sitting. Is the mean man in jail? She asked. He will be, Drummond said. Yes. She considered this seriously. Then she nodded, apparently deciding it was acceptable, and went back to her corner. Drummond looked at Silas. 7 o'clock tomorrow, he said. I'll need to start taking statements. They'll be ready, Silas said. After the marshal went back outside, Clara caught his eye from across the room. Something passed between them. Not a conversation, just an acknowledgement. The fight at the cabin had been one thing. What came next was going to require a different kind of courage entirely, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. Silas dished out what food there was. It wasn't much, but there was enough, and everyone got some, and the fire held through the night, and by the time the children were asleep, Silas sat in his chair and felt the specific exhaustion of a day that had asked everything of him, and the specific, complicated thing that was relief that didn't quite feel like peace. He touched the swollen cheekbone with 2 fingers and hissed through his teeth. No, not peace, but something. Something that was going to have to be enough until morning. Drummond started with Clara. That was the right call, and Silas knew it, though he wasn't in the room when it happened. Drummond had asked him to stay out, and he understood why. A federal proceeding needed to be clean, and clean meant no adult who might be perceived as coaching a witness present when the witness spoke. So Silas sat at the kitchen table with the broken one pushed against the wall and a new cup of coffee going cold in front of him, and listened to the sound of Clara's voice coming through the bedroom door, steady and low for 2 hours. He couldn't make out words. He didn't try to, but he could hear the rhythm of it, the long stretches where she talked without pause, then the shorter exchanges, then the long stretches again. Drummond's deputy was in there with a writing ledger, and Silas could hear the scratch of the pen in the silences. The other children waited in the main room. Thomas had his foot up on the settle and was turning a piece of wood over in his hands that Silas had given him, not carved into anything, just a smooth piece of pine from the stack, examining it with the focused attention of a child who needed something to hold. May sat close to him, not touching, but close, the way she'd been doing since the first night. Eli was at the window, which was where Eli went when he needed to think, and Danny was eating the last of the cornbread slowly, making it last. The other two, a girl named Ruth, who was 9 and barely spoke, and a boy named Cal, who was 11 and spoke too much when he was nervous, sat together at the far end of the room. Cal was telling Ruth something in a low voice that Silas couldn't hear, and Ruth was listening with the grave attention she gave everything. They were all listening to Clara's voice through the door. After 2 hours, the door opened. Clara came out first, then Drummond, then the deputy with the ledger tucked under his arm. Clara went straight to the window beside Eli and stood there looking out, which was what she did when she'd spent herself on something and needed a minute. Silas let her have it. Drummond came and sat across from Silas at the table. "She's extraordinarily precise," he said. Not like a compliment exactly, more like a man describing a tool that surprised him with its quality. Dates, names, specific statements, she's been holding all of that for 3 years. "She's been planning for 3 years, Silas said. Drummond looked at him. "You knew her plan was to testify?" "I knew her plan was to get out and take the others with her. Everything after that," Silas shrugged. "She's the kind of person who builds as she goes." Drummond sat with that for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I need the others today. I'd like to get to Denver with full statements before Blackwood's people start making arrangements." He paused. "He has a lawyer in Denver who is very good and very expensive, and the longer we wait, the more time that lawyer has to work with the paperwork Blackwood's filed over the years." "The placement papers," Silas said. "They're professionally done. Whoever forged them knew what they were doing." Drummond folded his hands on the table. "The children's testimony is the foundation of this case. Without it, we have my word about what I found at this ranch, which is something, but not enough." He looked around the room at the 5 children remaining. "I need to know they'll hold up in court." Silas followed his gaze. Thomas with his piece of wood. May with her serious eyes. Cal, who was 11 and scared and trying to hide it under the constant talking. Ruth, who hadn't said more than 30 words total since she'd arrived. "Ask them," Silas said. Drummond looked at him. "Don't ask me if they'll hold up. Ask them." Silas stood up. "They've been making decisions for themselves longer than most adults I know. They deserve to be asked." Drummond considered this for a moment, then stood and turned to the room. "I need to talk to each of you," he said. The children looked at him. "What you tell me goes into the record against Edgar Blackwood. It'll be used in a federal court, and it means you'd have to stand up in that court and say the same things in front of a judge." He paused. "I won't tell you it's easy. I won't tell you it isn't frightening. I'm just going to tell you it matters and ask if you're willing." The room was quiet. Thomas looked up from his piece of wood. "Will he be able to touch us? In the court?" "No," Drummond said. "He'll be on the other side of the room, and there will be men between you." Thomas thought about this. "Okay," he said, in the tone of someone who has weighed a serious matter and reached a conclusion. Cal's knee was bouncing under the table. "What if I forget things?" "We'll go through it all before you get to the courtroom," Drummond's deputy said from the corner. "Many times, if you need to. That's my job, to help you remember." "What if I cry?" This from May, who asked it the way she asked everything, direct and without embarrassment. "That's fine," Drummond said. "That's allowed." May nodded. "Okay," she said, the same word Thomas had used, the same measured weight in it, and Silas found that he had to look at the wall for a moment. Ruth hadn't said anything. She was looking at her hands in her lap. "Ruth," Silas said quietly. He'd learned her patterns. She responded to her name before she responded to anything else. like a person who needed to be reminded they existed before they could engage. You don't have to decide right now. She looked up. Her eyes went from Silas to Drummond and back. Then she looked at Clara, who had turned from the window and was watching her. Something moved between them. The particular communication of two people who have been through the same thing and understand each other without a common language of adequate words. Ruth looked back at Drummond. "I want to tell them about James," she said. Her voice was so quiet it barely made it across the room. "And Peter. And Samuel." The room went very still. Drummond's deputy opened his ledger and picked up his pen. It took 3 days to get all the statements down. Not because the children were slow or reluctant. Once they started talking, most of them found that the talking had its own momentum, that the things they'd been holding wanted to come out with a force that surprised them. It took 3 days because Drummond was meticulous, because he asked follow-up questions and asked for specifics and asked the same thing in 3 different ways to make sure the record was consistent, because he was building something that needed to hold weight in a federal courtroom, and he wasn't going to let it be fragile. Cal turned out to be the most useful witness of all, which surprised everyone, including Cal. His tendency to talk too much, which had been mildly exhausting over the past 2 weeks, turned out in the deposition room to be an absolute inventory of observed detail. He'd been at the compound longer than any of them except Clara, and he had the memory of someone who'd spent years in a place with nothing to do but watch and listen and store things away. He described Pruitt's management methods with an accuracy that made Drummond's deputy stop writing twice to look at the boy with an expression he was clearly trying to keep professional. Ruth spoke softly and without elaboration, but what she said was specific and devastating. She'd been in Tunnel 4 when the accident happened in Tunnel 7, heard it happen, heard the aftermath, been in the yard when they brought out what remained. She said this without crying, which was somehow worse than crying. She'd been 9 years old when she saw it. Thomas talked about the parts of the compound only he and the other smallest children had access to. The narrow crawl spaces where they pushed the ore carts that adults couldn't fit into, the way Mr. Pruitt had a system of demerit points that determined whether you ate that night or didn't, the particular cold of the mountain in the deep tunnels in January. He said all of this with the matter-of-fact precision of a 7-year-old describing his daily routine, because for 2 years it had been his daily routine, and that was the most terrible thing about it. Not that he struggled to describe it, but that he didn't. By the 3rd evening, Drummond had a ledger that was dense with writing on both sides of every page, and he sat at the table with Silas while the children slept and spread it all out between them. "We have a problem," he said. Silas had been expecting something like this. "The placement documents," Drummond said. "Blackwood's lawyer is going to argue that these children were placed legally and that any labor they performed was standard for the era and the placement agreement. He's going to argue that the deaths in Tunnel 7 were tragic accidents, documented as such by the county." He pressed his finger down on a page. "County documentation that was filed by Deputy Cole, who, by the way, is now claiming he had no knowledge of any irregularities." "Cole knew," Silas said. "I know Cole knew. You know Cole knew. The problem is what we can prove." Drummond leaned back in the chair. "I need something that breaks the documentation, something that shows the fraud at the source. Not the outcomes, which are terrible, but the mechanism. How did Blackwood make children disappear into that system in the first place?" He paused. "Clara says there was a man in Denver, a name Blackwood used." "Harlan Vetch," Silas said. He'd memorized everything Clara had told him. "I've already sent a man to find Harlan Vetch," Drummond said. "What I need is the man inside Blackwood's operation, someone who knows how the documents were made and where the money went." He looked at Silas directly. "Clara said there was a man named Pruitt who ran the day-to-day operation. She said he was efficient and frightened of Blackwood in equal measure." "Her words," Silas said. "Frightened men make calculations," Drummond said. "When they start calculating whether loyalty is worth the cost, sometimes they come to interesting conclusions. You think Pruitt will flip. I think Pruitt is sitting in a Denver jail right now without the resources Blackwood has, without the expensive lawyer, and with a clear view of what the charges against him look like compared to what they'd look like if he chose to cooperate." Drummond folded his hands. "I think within 2 weeks we'll hear from him." Silas was quiet for a moment. "How long before trial?" he said. 6 weeks minimum, more likely 8. The federal docket in Denver." Drummond made a gesture that encompassed the general chaos of frontier legal proceedings. It's not fast. 6 weeks, Silas said. He looked at the bedroom door behind which 6 children were asleep. They stay here. It wasn't a question. Drummond looked at him. Mr. Mercer, the appropriate arrangement for children in federal protective. They stay here, Silas said again. I know what those arrangements look like. I know what happens to children who get shuffled through official systems while proceedings run their course. He met Drummond's eyes. They stay here. They're safe here. You can post a man if you want. I'd welcome it, actually. But they're not going to some county home to wait 6 weeks while people argue about their futures in a courtroom. Drummond looked at him for a long time. I'll need a formal statement from you accepting custodial responsibility, he said. Write it up, Silas said. I'll sign it tonight. Drummond left 2 deputies and rode for Denver the following morning with his ledger and his case and the specific momentum of a federal marshal who believed he had what he needed and didn't want to lose it to delay. The 6 weeks that followed were not easy and not simple and had nothing of the false peace of the weeks before Blackwood's arrival. There was a quiet of a different quality now. Not the quiet of waiting for something bad to come, but the quiet of a long process grinding forward somewhere out of sight, in rooms they couldn't see, between men in suits arguing over pieces of paper. That kind of waiting had its own particular weight. Silas managed it the best he could, which meant managing it badly some days and better others. The children needed structure and they needed work, and those 2 things happened to be the same thing on a working ranch in winter, which was convenient. He set them to tasks in proportion to what they could do. Danny and Eli handled wood and water and helped with the animals, which they took to with an enthusiasm that told him how much they'd needed physical work with a purpose beyond someone else's gain. May and Ruth helped in the house, cooking and cleaning and mending, though he was careful about how he framed it, because the last thing any of them needed was work that felt like obligation attached to a debt. He framed it as contribution, as their share of things, and watched the difference in how they carried themselves when the framing was right. Clara did everything. She moved through the ranch like someone who was incapable of being idle, who'd learned that stillness was dangerous, and activity was the only reliable prophylactic against whatever lived in the quiet. She mended fences in temperatures that made Silas's nose run and his eyes water. She learned to harness Cutter with a focused efficiency that impressed the mule, who did not impress easily. She started cooking in the evenings, not because Silas asked, but because she seemed to need to do something with her hands between supper and sleep, and she was better at it than him, which he said so, and she told him that wasn't a high bar, which was probably true. He didn't try to talk to her about what had happened in the bedroom with Drummond. She'd tell him if she wanted to. She didn't, but he noticed that she slept more after the depositions, not easier necessarily, but more, like something that had been holding her rigid had loosened slightly, allowed her body to finally take what it needed. Thomas's foot healed. Not perfectly. The frostbite had left a kind of discoloration on 2 of the toes that Silas suspected was permanent, but he walked without pain by the end of the 3rd week, and by the 4th week he was following Silas around the barn with the dedicated attachment of a child who had found a specific adult useful and was not going to let that adult out of sight. "Why does Cutter make that sound?" Thomas asked one morning. They were in the barn, and the mule had produced his characteristic low grumble at being asked to shift over. "He's complaining," Silas said. "About what?" "About everything. He finds existence irritating." Silas moved around to the mule's other side. "We have that in common." Thomas considered this seriously. "I don't find existence irritating." "Give it time," Silas said, and then felt bad about it and looked at Thomas, who was grinning like he'd understood the joke without understanding it, which 7-year-olds were sometimes very good at. "Can I give him the apple?" Thomas said. "Go ahead." Thomas held the apple out on his palm the way Silas had shown him, flat, and Cutter took it with a delicacy that was entirely inconsistent with the rest of his personality. "He likes me," Thomas said, with pure satisfaction. "He likes the apple," Silas said. "He likes me," Thomas repeated in the tone of a person who has made up their mind. "What?" The letter from Drummond came on a Wednesday in the 5th week, and it was 2 pages, and Silas read it twice at the kitchen table before he said anything to anyone. Then he put the letter down and went to find Clara. She was at the fence line, working on a section that had heaved in the frost, using a tamping bar she'd found in the barn, and had apparently decided she knew how to use. She looked up when she heard him coming across the snow. Something in his face told her the letter had arrived. She set the tamping bar down carefully and waited. Pruitt gave a statement, Silas said. She was very still. Full cooperation. He had documents, his own copies, things he'd been keeping, apparently, for reasons that weren't entirely selfless, but don't matter now. Silas handed her the letter. He documented how the placement papers were forged, names, the process, money amounts. He documented payments to Cole and to Marshall Deeds. He has records of the tunnel's 7 deaths, his own records, not the falsified county ones, with the real names and real ages. He paused. He also gave up Harlan Vetch in Denver, who it turns out had been doing this with 2 other operations in the territory, not just Blackwood's. Clara was reading. He watched her eyes move across the page. Drummond says the trial's confirmed for 3 weeks from Thursday, Silas said. He wants all of us in Denver. You and the children will testify. I'll testify about what I found and what happened at the ranch. She finished the letter. She held it for a moment. Is it enough? She said. Drummond thinks so. He says Blackwood's lawyer's trying to negotiate a plea already, which means they know they're losing and they're trying to control the damage. Clara folded the letter with the same care she gave every task and handed it back to him. What happens to the ones who are still there? She said. The 14. Drummond's office has already moved to have the operation suspended pending trial. The 14 are in federal protective custody in Denver. He says they're... Silas checked his own memory of the letter. He says they're being cared for appropriately. I don't know exactly what that means. It means an institution, Clara said. Probably. She looked out at the fence line, at the mountains above them, at the specific quality of the winter sky that was everywhere out here. Enormous and flat blue and indifferent. And us? She said. After the trial? Silas had been thinking about this question since before the letter arrived, since before Drummond left, since the night he'd signed the custodial statement without entirely thinking through what it meant. He'd been thinking about it in the barn, and at the stove, and in the chair by the fire at night, turning it over and looking at it from different angles. And he'd arrived at something that felt true and also terrified him, which was usually the sign that a thing was genuinely important rather than just convenient. That depends, he said. Clara looked at him. On what you want, he said. All of you. Thomas is 7. He doesn't get to decide entirely for himself yet, but you do. And Danny and Eli and May and Ruth and Cal. He cleared his throat, which was a thing he did when he was working up to something. I've got a ranch. It's not much, but it's solid and it's mine and there's room. He looked at the fence line rather than her. You could stay. All of you. Properly. Not just waiting for proceedings to end, but stay. He paused. I'd have to go through whatever legal process makes that official, and I don't know exactly what that looks like, but Drummond could probably tell me. The wind moved across the open ground between them and the ridge. Clara was quiet long enough that he started to feel foolish. You live alone, she said. You've been living alone for 5 years. I know. You don't know us. Not really. I know you better than I knew most people I've called friend in my life, he said. I know that Thomas is going to get attached to Cutter more than any rational person should. I know Eli reads better than he lets on and doesn't want anyone to know. I know Cal talks when he's scared and goes quiet when he's thinking, which is backward for most people. I know May is the one who notices when someone else is hurting before they know it themselves. He finally looked at her. And I know you'd walk into a blizzard for any one of them without hesitating. Bas pompokiski. Clara looked at him. You'd be taking on 6 children who have problems, she said. I know. Thomas has nightmares, bad ones. Cal still checks the exits of every room he walks into. Ruth doesn't trust anyone who raises their voice for any reason. She paused. I don't sleep right. I probably won't for a long time. I sit up half the night by the fire, Silas said. I've done it for 5 years. I've got the chair for it. Something moved in her face. Not her deciding. She'd been deciding for a while, he thought. More like her letting him see that she'd decided. You'd have to mean it, she said. Not just say it and mean it for 6 months and then figure out it's too hard. These kids don't need one more person who leaves. I know what I'm offering, he said. Do you? Clara, he said. I carried that boy across a frozen field in a blizzard. I signed a federal document. I put 6 children in a root cellar and held a door against 8 men. He looked at her steadily. I'm not doing any of that for someone I'm planning to leave. She was quiet for a moment. Ask them, she said. Ask all of them. Don't ask me and have me tell them. Ask them. All right. Even Thomas, he's young, but he knows what he wants. All right. She picked up the tamping bar and turned back to the fence post. He went back to the cabin, and that evening, after supper, with the fire going and all 6 children distributed around the room in the various arrangements they'd fallen into over the weeks, Thomas on the settle, May and Ruth at the table with the mending, Eli at the window, Danny and Cal playing at some card game Danny had invented using rules that shifted whenever Danny was losing. Silas stood in the middle of the room. I need to ask you all something, he said. They looked at him. He asked. He didn't dress it up or make it sound certain or promise them anything beyond what he could see. A ranch, a valley, a working life, a person who would be there in the morning. He said it plain because they deserved plain, because they'd had enough of people who covered things up with smooth words. When he was done, the room was quiet. Thomas raised his hand very formally. Yes, Silas said. Can I still give Cutter the apple in the mornings? Yes, Silas said. Then I want to stay, Thomas said. Cal started talking immediately, which was how he said yes. May nodded once, precisely, which was how she did most things. Ruth didn't say anything, but she looked at Silas and then looked at the floor and then looked at Silas again and nodded so slightly it was almost not visible. Danny said, yeah, obviously, in the tone of a teenager who found the question barely worth the air, which was the highest endorsement he had in his register. Eli turned from the window. You're not going to change, he said. Like, you're not going to be different once the trial's done and it's just regular life? I'm going to be exactly as irritating as I've been, Silas said. Probably more so. I have more demands in regular life than in a crisis. Eli looked at him for another second. Okay, he said, and turned back to the window. Claire was leaning against the door frame to the bedroom, arms crossed. She'd heard all of it. She didn't say anything when he looked at her. But she was almost smiling, which for her was the same as a different person throwing their arms wide open. And Silas decided that was enough for tonight. He started clearing the supper dishes. Denver in 3 weeks, he said. Drummond's arranged accommodation. We'll testify, we'll see it through, and then we'll come home. He said the word without planning to, without thinking about it. It came out on its own. We'll come home, he said again, and it still sounded right, and nobody in the room contradicted it. The fire held. Outside, the stars were out over the valley, enormous and cold and clear, and the mountains stood dark against the sky the way they always did, indifferent to everything that happened beneath them. But inside the cabin there was light, and there were people, and that made a difference that the mountains didn't have an opinion about one way or the other, but Silas did. He did the dishes. Cal helped without being asked, and that was something. That was quietly and without announcement the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet but was already underway. Denver was louder than any of them were ready for. Silas had been there twice in the past 5 years, both times briefly, both times for supplies and nothing else. And he'd forgotten the specific quality of a city in winter, the noise of it, the press of people, the smell of coal smoke and horse, and something underneath both that was just the smell of too many human beings in close proximity. He watched the children's faces as the wagon moved through the streets toward the address Drummond had given him, and what he saw was the instinctive flinching of people who'd learned that crowds meant danger, that a lot of people in one place meant someone was in charge, and that someone was probably not on your side. Thomas sat pressed against his arm the entire ride, not saying anything, which for Thomas was unusual enough to mean something. It's loud, May said, to no one in particular. It is, Silas said. Do we have to stay here long? Few days, then home. She nodded and went back to watching the street with the focused wariness of someone cataloging threat levels, which she did unconsciously now. He'd noticed it in the barn, in the field, anywhere new. Her eyes going to exits before anything else. Drummond had arranged rooms above a boarding house on Larimer Street, a woman named Mrs. Albrecht, who ran the place with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who'd seen everything and had decided to be professionally unimpressed by all of it. She looked at the 6 children, looked at Silas, and said, breakfast at 7, no exceptions, in a tone that precluded negotiation, and that was the entirety of her orientation speech. Silas liked her immediately. The rooms were clean and small, and the children split between two of them with Silas in a third, and that first night in Denver nobody slept well, which was maybe predictable. The city noise came through the windows in a way that the mountain silence never prepared you for, and around midnight Silas heard small feet in the hallway, and then a knock at his door, and opened it to find Thomas standing there in his socks holding his piece of pine wood. "The sounds are wrong," Thomas said. "I know," Silas said, and let him in, and Thomas slept on the floor next to the bed on a blanket Silas put down, and was asleep in 4 minutes, which was the specific superpower of small children and something Silas envied completely. The federal courthouse on 16th Street was a stone building that was trying very hard to communicate permanence and authority through its architecture, and largely succeeded. High ceilings, long corridors, the sound of boot heels on marble carrying farther than intended in ways that made everything feel exposed. Drummond met them in the corridor outside the main courtroom on the morning of the first day, and he had the focused efficiency of a man who had prepared for this specifically and was running on the particular energy that comes from believing you have what you need and wanting to use it before anything changes. "Blackwood's lawyer is a man named Forsyth," he told Silas quietly, while his deputy took the children to a waiting room. "He's good. He'll be methodical, and he'll try to make the children seem unreliable. It's age, emotional state, inability to accurately remember specifics." He paused. "He'll also try to introduce the placement papers as legitimate documentation and put the burden on us to prove fraud rather than on Blackwood to prove legitimacy." "Can he make that work?" Silas said. "With another judge, maybe. Judge Aldrich." Drummond allowed himself a small, controlled expression of satisfaction. "Aldrich has been on the federal bench for 22 years and has a specific and well-documented contempt for men who abuse legal process. He's not going to be moved by paperwork." He straightened his coat. "But Forsyth will try." Silas looked through the small window in the courtroom door. The room was filling. Journalists, he could tell some of them by the notebooks already out, and others who were simply there the way people came to watch proceedings, the frontier version of theater. On the left side of the courtroom, at the defense table, he could see the back of Blackwood's head, the gray coat, the trimmed hair, the same posture as the day he'd ridden into the yard. The posture of a man who believed the architecture of the situation was temporary. "Clara goes first," Drummond said. "She knows." "She's ready?" Silas thought about Clara at the fence line with the tamping bar, Clara at the window at midnight, Clara holding the rifle in the doorway, Clara with her arms out slightly at her sides between danger and the children behind her. "Yes," he said. He couldn't be in this room when she testified. Federal proceedings, witnesses sequestered, the same rules that had kept him out of the deposition room. He sat in the corridor on a wooden bench and listened to the muffled sound of voices through the heavy door, and did what he'd been doing for weeks in the chair by the fire. Waited, and did not let himself think too far ahead. Eli sat beside him. He'd asked to stay in the corridor rather than the waiting room, and Silas hadn't argued. They sat there together without talking for almost an hour, which Eli was apparently comfortable with, and Silas definitely was. Then Eli said, "Do you think it'll work?" "I think Drummond wouldn't have brought us here if he didn't believe it would," Silas said. "That's not the same as yes." "No," Silas said. "It's not." Eli was quiet for a moment. "What happens if it doesn't?" Silas looked at the marble floor. "Then we try the next thing. There are appeals processes. There are other courts. There are newspapers." He thought of Hargrove, who had in fact printed a piece 3 weeks ago that had caused enough noise in Denver circles that 2 members of the territorial legislature had made public statements. The thing about Blackwood is that he built everything on the assumption that nobody would look closely. The looking has started. That doesn't stop just because one courtroom has a bad day. Eli absorbed this. "But you think it'll work," he said. "Yeah," Silas said. "I think it'll work." From behind the heavy door came the sound of a raised voice. Not shouting, but emphatic, carrying. Then a gavel. Then quiet. "That's Forsyth objecting to something," Silas said. "How do you know?" Because Drummond told me Forsyth objects to everything in the first hour to establish the rhythm early. He paused. Drummond said to count the objections. If it's more than 12 in the first hour, Forsyth is worried. Eli looked at the door. We can't hear enough to count. I know, Silas said. I'm just repeating what Drummond said. Eli almost smiled. He did that. Got close to smiling and then didn't quite complete it, like he kept the last fraction in reserve. Silas had stopped trying to get him the rest of the way there. He figured Eli would smile fully when he had a reason that satisfied him, and that was his right. Clara came out 2 hours and 40 minutes later. She walked out of the courtroom door and stood in the corridor and didn't say anything for a moment. Her face was doing the thing it did after she'd spent herself on something, that particular stillness. Silas stood up. How was Forsyth? He said. Unpleasant, she said. He kept asking me to confirm that I was scared when things happened. Like being scared meant I couldn't remember accurately. She paused. I told him being scared and being accurate weren't mutually exclusive. Judge Aldrich seemed to think that was a reasonable point. Good. Forsyth asked me 3 different ways whether I might have misunderstood what I heard through doors and walls. I told him I'd had 3 years to think about what I'd heard, and I was confident in my understanding. She straightened slightly. He didn't ask a 4th time. Eli was looking at her with the particular expression he reserved for things that genuinely impressed him. Who's next? Clara asked. Pruitt, Silas said. Drummond's putting him on this afternoon. Something moved in her face at the name. Not forgiveness. He didn't think she was there and didn't think she needed to be. More like the acknowledgement that even complicated things could be useful. Good, she said. He knows everything. Pruitt was not a dramatic man. He was thin and 50-ish and had the look of someone who'd spent years making himself invisible in the presence of someone dangerous, a habit that had gotten into his body and stayed. He sat in the witness box and answered Drummond's questions in a flat, precise voice, and did not look at Blackwood at the defense table. And what he said was a systematic dismantling of every piece of documentation Blackwood's lawyer had tried to present as legitimate. The placement papers. He'd helped produce them. He named the process, the specific man in the county clerk's office who had accepted payment to stamp them, the dates, the amounts. The accident in Tunnel 7, he produced his own records, the ones he'd kept in a locked box in his quarters for 2 years, not out of conscience exactly, but out of the self-protective instinct of a man who understood that when an arrangement collapsed, the people at the bottom were the first ones buried. He'd been keeping his own record of everything, a kind of insurance, and now that insurance had become the most important document in the room. He named names that went beyond Blackwood. A man in the Territorial Land Office, a judge in Holt County, not Aldrich, a different man, who had signed documents without examining them in exchange for consideration that Pruitt itemized with uncomfortable specificity. Deputy Cole, whose arrangement with Blackwood he described in detail that made Cole, sitting in the spectator gallery with a different kind of legal trouble incoming, visibly pale. Forsyth's cross-examination lasted 45 minutes and accomplished very little, which Drummond explained to Silas afterward was about as well as you could do with a cooperative witness who had documentary evidence. The children testified over 2 days. Drummond had sequenced them carefully. Thomas first, because Thomas at 7, speaking plainly about crawl spaces and demerit systems and the cold of January tunnels, had an effect on a room that no amount of legal maneuvering could rebut. Not because he was performing, he wasn't. Because he was just telling you what had happened, in the simple declarative sentences of a child describing his experience. And the gap between what those sentences contained and what any child's sentences should contain was something a courtroom full of adults had to sit with. Forsyth did not cross-examine Thomas extensively. There wasn't a way to do it that didn't look like exactly what it was. May cried twice during her testimony and kept going both times, which was what she'd said she'd do. Ruth spoke quietly enough that Judge Aldrich asked her to speak up twice, and each time she did, raising her voice with visible effort, and the effort itself was something the room felt. Cal talked too much and was occasionally redirected by Drummond, but his inventory of detail was exactly what it had been in the deposition, overwhelming in its specificity, impossible to credibly refute. Danny testified last of the 6 children, and he was 14 and tried to be composed about it, in the way that teenage boys tried to be composed about things that mattered, which meant he was mostly successful and then briefly wasn't. When Drummond asked him about the 3 boys who died, and Danny had known all three of them, had worked beside them, and the composure cracked for about 30 seconds before he pulled it back together and finished answering the question. Silas testified on the third day. He described finding the children, Clara's account of Blackwood's operation, the arrival of Cole and the second man, the night he sent the letters, Blackwood's arrival with 8 armed men in legal papers, the gunfight. He said it all clearly and without embellishment, in the manner of a man who'd given testimony before and understood that the facts, stated plainly, were more persuasive than any decoration. Forsyth tried to suggest that Silas had coached the children. Silas told him he'd given them paper and pen and let Clara talk for 2 hours, and had written down what she said. Forsyth tried to suggest that Silas had a personal interest in discrediting Blackwood. Silas told him his personal interest was in the welfare of 6 children who'd been in his home for 2 months, which was true and which he was not going to apologize for. Forsyth tried a third angle, and Judge Aldrich, who had been watching the proceedings with the expression of a man whose patience was a finite and closely monitored resource, told Forsyth to move on. Forsyth moved on. Closing arguments took a day, and then the jury, 12 men who had been sitting in that room for 4 days absorbing everything, went to deliberate. And Drummond told Silas not to expect a fast verdict because fast verdicts in complex federal cases weren't necessarily good verdicts. And then the jury came back in 6 hours. 6 hours was fast. Silas was in the corridor with all 6 children when Drummond came through the door to find them. He looked at Silas. "Guilty," he said. "All counts." The corridor was very quiet. Then Thomas said, "What does that mean?" And Clara said quietly, "It means it's over." And Thomas said, "Oh." And then May started crying, not the distressed crying of fear, but something else entirely, the kind that comes when a thing that has been held tight for a very long time is finally allowed to release, and Ruth put her arm around May's shoulders, which was the first time Silas had seen Ruth voluntarily touch anyone, and that undid something in him that he was going to pretend for the rest of the day had not been undone. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then he looked back down. Cal was talking. Of course Cal was talking, He was describing the verdict to Eli in detail, despite Eli having been present for the announcement, rephrasing it in different ways as if the right formulation would make it more real. Eli was listening with more patience than usual, which was probably his version of processing. Danny was very still, looking at the floor and then looking up, and his face had a quality that Silas hadn't seen on it before. Not happiness exactly, nothing that clean, but the beginning of the expression of a person allowing themselves to believe something they've been afraid to believe. Clara stood slightly apart from the others, the way she always did. Silas went and stood beside her. "Sentence?" she said. "Drummond says Aldrich will handle that separately. Given the charges and the evidence, he expects significant prison time. Years." He paused. "The operation is being dismantled. The mines are under federal order. The other 14 children are already in the process of being placed properly. Real placements, with oversight." She nodded. "Cole?" she said. "Separate charges. He'll be tried on his own." Silas paused. "Drummond thinks he'll take a plea." "And the judge in Holt, the man in the land office?" "Drummond's people are moving on both of them." He looked at her. "It's not all going to happen at once. Some of it will take months, but it's moving." She was quiet for a moment. "Harlan Vetch," she said, "the man in Denver who helped with the documents. The name I remembered from the door." "Arrested last week," Silas said. "I got a note from Drummond 2 days before we left. He's cooperating with a broader investigation. Apparently Blackwood wasn't the only one using him." Clara turned to look at the other children. The small group of them in the marble corridor, May still crying, Cal still talking, Thomas now sitting on the floor against the wall because he was 7 and could get away with it. "They did it," she said. "All of them." "You did it," Silas said. She shook her head. "I got us out of the mountain. That was the part I could control." She paused. "The rest of it, the letters, the marshals, Drummond, that was you." "The testimony was them," Silas said. "I didn't put words in their mouths. I didn't tell Thomas what to say or Ruth how to say it. They just—" He stopped for a moment. "They just told the truth. That's all they did." Clara looked at him with the steady measuring look she'd had in the abandoned cabin when she'd first seen his lantern, and for a second he felt the strange layered quality of time, how far they'd come from that cabin, and how much of what had happened in between had been impossible to predict from that starting point. "Let's go home," she said. They were back in the valley by the end of the week. The ride-up from Gunnison, the last leg of the return, was done in a quiet that was different from every other kind of quiet the winter had produced. Not the quiet of waiting, not the quiet of aftermath, just the quiet of people returning to a place they'd decided was theirs. The mountains came up around them in the late afternoon light, turning amber and then rose, and then the particular dark blue of winter dusk. And when the cabin came into view across the snow-covered field, with the barn behind it and the fence line Silas and Clara had fixed together running in a mostly straight line toward the tree line, Thomas said, "There it is," from his spot in the wagon bed, as if announcing something that needed announcing. "There it is," Silas said. He put the wagon in the barn and unharnessed the horses and went to give Cutter his apple. He'd brought one from Denver, wrapped in cloth in the saddlebag, because that was either sentimental or practical, and he'd stopped being able to tell the difference. And Cutter took it with his characteristic delicacy and then gave Silas a look of comprehensive judgment. "I was gone 9 days," Silas told him. Cutter turned away. "That's not fair," Silas said. Thomas was already at the fence of the corral, watching this exchange with pure delight. "He's still mad," Thomas said. "He'll get over it," Silas said, and went to start the fire. The legal process for adoption was not fast and was not simple, and involved a great deal of correspondence with federal offices and a trip to the county seat that Silas had been dreading because it required putting on a better coat than he owned and trying to explain a situation that didn't fit into any of the standard forms the clerk produced. The clerk was a man named Abernethy, who had the resigned patience of someone whose job involved the endless friction between bureaucratic categories and actual human situations. He looked at Silas across the desk. He looked at the children arranged behind him. He looked back at Silas. "6, he said. "6, Silas confirmed. "At once." "They come as a group," Silas said. "That's not negotiable." Abernethy looked at the forms. He looked at the federal letter Drummond had written, which was precise and unambiguous and carried the weight of the court ruling and Drummond's own considerable authority. He looked at Silas again. "You understand this is highly irregular," he said. "I understand that the regular process failed these children for years," Silas said, "and that I'd like to offer them something that doesn't." Abernethy was quiet for a moment. "The youngest is 7, he said. "Just turned 8, Silas said. Thomas had turned 8 the week after they got back from Denver, an event celebrated with a lopsided cake that May and Ruth had made, and a carved wooden horse that Silas had spent 3 weeks finishing in the evenings after the children were asleep. Abernethy looked at Thomas, who looked back at him with the direct, unconcerned gaze of a child who had already decided this man was not a threat and was therefore not particularly interesting. "All right," Abernethy said, and pulled out a different stack of forms. It took months. Forms submitted and returned for correction and resubmitted. Letters from Drummond and from Judge Aldrich, who took a specific interest in the matter that Silas suspected was his way of seeing things through. A home assessment visit from a federal officer who came in February and spent 2 days at the ranch, sleeping in the barn, at his own insistence, and watching how things worked. Silas spent those 2 days being observed doing ordinary things, cooking, working with the children, explaining to Thomas why you couldn't just give Cutter unlimited apples without medical consequence, being corrected by Clara when he misdirected Eli on a fence repair. The officer wrote his report and sent it to Denver and didn't tell Silas what it said. The papers came in March, on a morning when the snow was finally starting to come off the south slopes, and the first faint green was showing in the lower fields. Silas was at the table with his coffee when the rider came up the trail and left an envelope and rode back down. He opened it, read it twice, set it down. Clara came in from outside, stomping mud off her boots. The thaw had begun, and the yard was a mess, and looked at him and then looked at the envelope on the table. "Well?" she said. He turned the papers so she could read them. She read. Her face did the thing where almost nothing showed, but the things that did show were everything. She put the papers back on the table and stood there for a moment. "I'll get the others," she said. He sat at the table and listened to the sound of the cabin filling up. Boots on the floor, voices overlapping, the particular acoustic quality of a small space with 8 people in it, which was a sound he'd spent 5 years without, and which had turned out to be a sound he needed more than he'd understood. They came in, Thomas first and fastest because he always was. May and Ruth together, Cal talking before he was through the door. Danny, with his studied casualness that didn't quite conceal the attention underneath. Eli last, closing the door behind him, looking at Silas's face before anything else. Silas pushed the papers to the middle of the table. "It's done," he said. "Officially and legally done. As of this morning." Nobody said anything for a second. Then Thomas climbed onto the bench beside Silas and leaned against his arm the way he'd been doing for 4 months. The particular comfortable weight of a small child who has decided where he belongs. "So you're our dad now," Thomas said. The word landed in the room differently than any other word that had been said in it, landing on all of them, on Silas most of all, in a place he hadn't known was still available for landing. He cleared his throat. He looked at the table for a moment. "That's what the paper says," he said, when he had his voice back. Thomas appeared to think this was exactly sufficient. He picked up his piece of pine wood from the table. He carried it everywhere, that piece of wood, and turned it over in his hands, satisfied. Cal said, "Well, finally," in the tone of a 13-year-old who has been waiting on adults to accomplish something obvious, which made Danny tell him to shut up, which made Cal explain at length why he shouldn't have to shut up, which was normal enough to feel like home. Ruth was looking at the papers. She reached out and touched the edge of one page, just lightly, with her fingertip, and didn't say anything. May was sitting across the table from Silas, and she looked at him with the direct, serious eyes she always had, the ones that noticed everything. "Are you happy?" she said. He thought about it honestly, the way May's questions generally required. "Yeah," he said. "I think I actually am." She nodded, apparently satisfied, and went to see about breakfast. Spring came slowly and then all at once, the way it does in mountain country. And the ranch came alive in the particular chaotic way of a place with children and animals and work, and no shortage of things going wrong in ways that required improvisation. Eli turned out to have a talent with the horses that Silas recognized from the first time he saw him with the bay mare. The patience, the attention, the willingness to go slowly. He started teaching him properly in April, not as a lesson but as a thing they did together in the mornings before the rest of the day's work. And Eli absorbed it with the same intensity he brought to everything he decided was worth his time. Danny was 17 by summer and had opinions about the ranch operation that were more useful than Silas expected and less useful than Danny thought, which was the correct ratio for 17. They argued about the south pasture fence. Danny wanted to extend it. Silas thought the ground was wrong. And Silas turned out to be right, which Danny accepted without much grace, but also without much bitterness, which was the important part. Cal's talking remained. It always would, Silas suspected, but he'd started channeling it, found out in April that the school teacher in the valley town 5 miles south held a class on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and Cal had started going and was apparently remarkable at it, at the particular art of making an argument that held together, and the schoolteacher had told Silas in a chance meeting at the general store that Cal was the most verbally gifted student she'd taught in 10 years, and did Silas plan to send him further for his education? Silas had looked at Cal and said he'd have to ask him. Cal, when asked, had said he wanted to become a lawyer, which he said in the same tone he said everything but with a specific steadiness underneath it that wasn't there for other things. "Then we'll figure out how," Silas said. They were still figuring, but they were figuring. Ruth remained quiet. Probably always would. That was her nature as much as it was her history, and Silas had stopped trying to distinguish between the two because it didn't matter. What changed was not her volume, but her ease, the gradual relaxation of the constant vigilance, the way she stopped checking exits after about 6 months, the way she started sitting near windows instead of against walls. She had a garden by summer. Nobody had suggested it. She'd just started turning over a patch of ground behind the cabin one morning, and by July had green things growing that she tended with the focused care she gave everything she decided was hers. May noticed everything, always. It was her gift, and occasionally her burden. She felt the mood of the house before anyone else, knew when someone was off before they knew it themselves. She came to Silas on a night in June, when he was sitting on the porch after supper, the kind of summer evening where the air cooled fast off the mountains and the stars came up thick, and she sat beside him and said, "You're sad tonight," in the same direct way she asked if he was happy. He looked at her. "A little," he said. "It passes." "My mother used to get like this," she said. She'd get quiet in the evenings, and I'd sit with her. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything, and she sat with him the way she used to sit with her mother, and the evening came down around them, and that was all it needed to be. Thomas at 8 was Thomas at 7 with more opinions and a deeper relationship with Cutter that had moved somehow into something that worked both ways. The mule who found existence irritating had developed a specific tolerance for Thomas that extended to letting the boy lean against him in the corral for long periods, without expressing his usual comprehensive disapproval of contact. Silas watched this sometimes from the barn door and thought about the strange democracy of affection, how it didn't follow rules and couldn't be engineered, and how Thomas had gotten from a mule what he'd gotten from Thomas, some uncomplicated version of being simply undramatically wanted. Clara was 22 by the time the summer fully opened up, and she was different from the girl in the abandoned cabin in every way that mattered, and not different at all in the way she stood, that particular posture, arms slightly out, ready. The readiness was still there. He didn't think it would ever fully go away, and he'd stopped thinking it needed to. She managed the household accounts by spring, not because he'd asked her to, but because she'd noticed they needed managing, and she did it with the methodical precision she brought to everything. She rode out to check the fence lines on her own. She knew every animal by behavior and temperament. She made decisions, and they were good decisions, and sometimes he had to remind himself that she was 22 and not 40. There was an evening in August, warm, the valley giving off the stored heat of the day, the children scattered around various activities in the last light, when Silas came out of the barn and found Clara sitting on the top rail of the corral, watching the horses move in the dusk. He came and stood beside her. "You're not going to fall," he said, because she'd never sat on that rail before and it was higher than it looked. "I know," she said, and she sounded like someone who knew it. They stood and sat in the quiet for a while, and the horses moved in the low light, and from inside the cabin came the sounds of the evening, Cal's voice, May's laugh at something, the particular thump of Thomas failing to be quiet while trying to be quiet. "Do you think about them?" Silas said. "The 14 others." "Not as much as I used to," Clara said. She was quiet for a moment. "That feels wrong, but I think it means I'm getting somewhere." "You got them out," he said. "The process that started because of what you gave Drummond is still going. 2 of them have been placed with families. I got a letter from Drummond last month, 3 more in placements under review." "I know," she said. "I got the same letter." He'd given her access to his correspondence months ago, and she'd started managing it with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else, which was probably appropriate. "James Arlo," she said. "Peter Hatch, Samuel Webb." She said the names the way she always said them when they came up. Not like a wound, not performatively, just with weight. Somebody knew them. Somebody somewhere had a mother or a father or a sister who didn't know what happened. "Drummond's people are working on notifications," Silas said. "It may take years to find everyone, but they're trying." She nodded. He looked at the mountains, gone dark against a sky that still held some light in the west, that particular last light of a summer evening that made the high country look like something from another world. He thought about what it meant to survive a thing, not just to get through it, but to build something in the aftermath, to take the specific disaster of your life and make something out of the rubble that wasn't just survival, but was actually, genuinely, a life. He'd thought, after his wife and daughter died, that he understood loss, and he had, as well as anyone could, but he hadn't understood the other side of it, hadn't understood that the same capacity that made you vulnerable to devastation was also the capacity that made you available to the opposite of devastation, if you could keep it open long enough. He hadn't kept it open on purpose. He'd had 6 children dropped into a frozen cabin in a blizzard, and the opening had been forced, which was maybe how it had to be for people like him, who were good at closing things. "I've been thinking about something," Clara said. "Tell me."